Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Making Digital Literacy More Inclusive. And just to define our terms here, when we're talking about digital literacy, it's essentially the ability to use digital technology or communication tools or networks to locate, evaluate, integrate, and create information, and the general ability to understand and use info in multiple formats, and a person's ability to perform tasks effectively in a digital environment. And what we mean by data literacy is the ability to read, create, and communicate data as information, and the ability to tell stories using data. And as we all know, these two things are critical to all of our workflows and processes in museums and within a number of sectors. So the goals of this session are twofold. The panel brings together a number of individuals from a variety of institutions, both within and outside the museum sector, who are working on initiatives both on data literacy and digital literacy, and will provide case studies of some of the projects they're working on, as well as lessons learned and some good takeaways, hopefully, for this audience. In terms of thinking about the human-centered part of this program, our goal is to provide good examples of ways that you can connect with your audiences and your users, but also to serve as a reminder that museums aren't in this alone. We have a number of individuals and other organizations and institutions who are facing the same challenges we are. And so by bringing this panel together of individuals from libraries and grant-making institutions, we're hoping that we can find, common ground that we can discuss a little bit during the Q&A. And just to give you a sense of how the hour is going to flow, we'll each of the panelists will introduce ourselves. We'll each give about a 6-minute case study of our projects, and then we'll have hopefully about 10 or 15 minutes for some question and answer that will be led by Carolyn Royston. So I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Beth Bulwer. I'm an archaeological analyst that's based at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which is at Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I work on a project called the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, or DAX. And this is a relational database and web-based archive that serves out open data to researchers and the public on archaeological sites of enslavement in the southeastern United States and the Caribbean.
I'm Eric Johnson. I'm the head of innovative media at Virginia Commonwealth University Libraries, which I'll be telling you more about, but it's a creative space new to the library, doing kind of 3D making, multimedia, and some other related activities there. So we're almost a year old now there.
Hello, my name is Pete Alonzi, and I work at the University of Virginia Library as a data scientist. And today my case study is going to be talking about an educational workshop that we do. And it deals with Python and programming, so it's digital.
My name's Robert Connolly, and I retired from my paying job this past September, where I was on the faculty in the anthropology department at the University of Memphis and taught in museum studies up there as well. And I was also the director of the C.H. Nash Museum at Chucalissa. My primary research interests are around using cultural heritage as a tool for empowering underserved communities. Carried out projects extensively in Memphis area, which I'll talk about here, and also more recently in some ongoing projects in rural communities in the Ancash region of Peru.
My name is Leslie Lehenga, and I am a research and evaluation consultant right now. But I was recently at the National Endowment for the Humanities. I've also worked at the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Gallery of Art, and the Smithsonian.
Great, thank you. So I'll get us started with my case study, which is focused on a project that we did, that DAX did about 3 or 4 months ago. And so the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery is a web-based archive that makes data available, archaeological data available for researchers and the public. And primarily we serve content specialists, so mostly archaeologists and faculty members at universities, graduate students, undergraduate students. But we also have had the opportunity to try and grow our user base and extend into K through 12 educators. But a lot of the workshops and training we've done have mostly focused on teaching users about our PostgreSQL database, programming in R and Excel to do data analysis. So when we were asked by the National Endowment for Humanities to give a workshop for teachers who were coming to Monticello to learn about how they could use digital resources in their classroom, we really had to rethink how we were going to be able to offer something for teachers where they could make a connection with archaeological data and analysis and our database and website in a way that would be relatable and familiar to them. And this was a challenge for us because it was the first time we tried to do anything like this. And so we talked with a number of individuals in our institution and a few people outside of our institution. And one of the big takeaways we had was that people really encouraged us to try and include some form of data analysis in the workshop to give teachers an opportunity to experience archaeological analysis. So we decided to keep things fairly simple and do a brief intro to our database and our content, and then try and do a quantitative analysis in Excel with the teachers. And we realized fairly quickly that this was not really a good match for our audience because the teachers had difficulty connecting with that content. We gave them a spreadsheet full of numbers, and even though we'd shown them some of the artifacts, it was immediately clear they weren't able to make the connections we were hoping they would make because we hadn't provided the right groundwork for them to be able to relate to the data. So that was based on our observations, and we also did a brief survey, exit survey after they took the workshop, and their responses reinforced our observations. So we were able to offer this workshop twice, two times that were 1 week apart. And so in that week, we completely revamped what we decided to offer. And we stripped away some of the digital in order to try and think about why we wanted them to connect with the archaeological data and how we were hoping they would. So when we met with a second group of teachers the next week, we divided the group into two different subgroups with two different exercises. The first exercise really focused on making them familiar with archaeological data, but not quantitative numbers, but actual artifacts. So showing them how we do artifact analysis, specifically on ceramics, letting them touch the ceramics, sort the ceramics, learn how we differentiate different types, and really getting to see how we do analysis. And then after going through that, allowing them to do something more quantitative by using methods that we use to try and date sites with ceramics. The second workshop, or the second exercise, did focus on using our database and our website. So we did bring in the digital, but the data we had them download was based on images and objects, which were ideas they were already familiar with and could readily integrate into their lesson plans. And so based on our observations on the exit surveys, we found that this second workshop was much more successful, although there were certainly still ways that we could improve. But some of the takeaways for us were that we felt initially we didn't do as much as we could have to really learn about our audience and our users while we were designing the program. Fortunately for us, we had an environment where we could do iterative development, so we were able to take some risks and do something a little bit different, but also learn and pivot very quickly to try and adjust when we realized our users' needs weren't being met. The second takeaway was that we realized that for the concepts and the goals to be understood and for the teachers to be able to make the connections we wanted them to with the data, we had to strip out the digital. So really helping them be familiar with some of the data concepts, with the artifacts, and not overwhelming them with both digital and data at the same time. And finally, we were really happy that we had this opportunity to take this risk and kind of reach out to engage a new audience and have this kind of opportunity for iterative development. So I'd also encourage people to try, if you're developing a program or a workshop like this, it really is ideal to be able to have a couple back-to-back or every few weeks where you can try different techniques, get feedback, and then adjust as necessary for the next time.
All right, so as I mentioned, I'm the head of a new space at the library at Virginia Commonwealth University, and it is in fact called The Workshop. So to just make it all confusing, we're talking about workshops, and then now I'm talking about a space called The Workshop. And it's kind of the unofficial mission that I often share with people when they come in to visit us is that we're there to help people explore and communicate their ideas in ways other than text. a library, of course, traditionally focuses on textual matters, helps people write papers, do publication, sort of textual publication. But more and more libraries, museums, other spaces are, of course, diving into support for multimedia by making that sort of thing. And sort of our three kind of focuses in our space are multimedia production, so that side of digital especially, multimedia production, and kind of the hands-on making 3D modeling movement, and then emerging technologies. So practically what that means for us is that we have a huge collection of circulating media equipment. People can check out, students, faculty, staff can check out equipment, cameras, camcorders, audio recorders. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. You should bring that up, thank you. So that's the outside. Of course, it's behind glass because that means we're cool. So, and we're in the basement because we're technology. So that kind of goes without saying. So it's part of a new library building. So we got a chance to sort of design this space. I should have made that pretty clear. But so we have this circulating media collection, media equipment collection, as I say, camcorders, digital audio recorders, also unusual things like portable green screen and lighting kits, telescope, microscopes, so a bunch of other kinds of equipment people can check out, like books. We also, in that space, have an audio recording studio and a video recording studio, both accessible, everything that we have accessible to the entire university community. Also a small video gaming room, which is where we do virtual reality and augmented reality work, as well as part of that kind of emerging technology side of things. And a relatively large kind of dedicated, what you would call a maker space. I mean, you could say the entire department's a maker space, but this is more the laser cutter 3D printing side of the maker movement. And the literacies around that. And then of course we have workstations that's actually behind the glass there. Where you can see here is workstations with hardware and software to support the rest of this program. So broadly, that's what we're doing. The planning actually started with basically me. I came in as the director of this space and they said, welcome aboard. You now have 4 weeks to get a design to the architects because we're in the middle of the planning for the new building. And so I did have 2 staff members that I inherited as well. So the 3 of us really kind of worked through what this could look like in a month. So I guess, if you want to go to the next slide. Some of the things that happened as we were doing this planning, so the approaches that we took on a dimension here, we did start with conversations. It's actually the same thing that has come up again and again, and Beth just mentioned it with hers, this idea of knowing your audience. So we very much tried to reach out to people that we knew who had interest in these areas to see what a space like this might be, what the technologies should be, what the program ought to look like in their opinions. And we also did, of course, a lot of research into what other people were doing, because all this is emerging enough, or was emerging enough at the time, that we wanted to make sure that we really kind of got a hold of what seems to be working elsewhere. It's sort of a bit of a spaghetti against the wall model of approaching stuff like this. And we were lucky in that we could do that, and that is kind of an approach that we're trying to do. Some basic conversational and book kind of research for things like that. We did actually also kind of pay attention to our own particular literacies, what we came into it knowing. And when I say literacies, I mean in media production or in making things, in digital design work, in sort of creativity literacy, which is something also we're interested in proposing. That also helped us figure out what we don't do or what we can't do very well yet, and so what we might move forward to going into the future. And then because, of course, we, the 3 of us that started, and now there's 4 full-time staff members, don't have all the skills we need, we also partnered with a lot of people, especially other units in the library that may offer things we don't. We don't do computer programming out of our department. We don't teach programming, but there are other places in the library that can help people with that, or doing web hosting or that sort of thing. So again, partnerships being kind of a crucial point as we approach that. Takeaways for us, this idea of hospitality is a big thing, and what I mean by that is that we tried to make very low barriers to participation. We tried to meet people where they are in their kind of digital journey. Some people are very much beginning in things, other people are very advanced in things. We're trying to support both of those. With this sort of unofficial mission statement that we help people explore and communicate ideas in ways other than text, really guides both what is included in our space and what is not included in the space. And I think people need to give themselves some room to say, no, that actually is not part of our mission. That's not what we do. Let us help you find somebody who does do that. That's of course, in a larger library where there are partnerships, that kind of thing can be easy. But I think it also helps you to be able to kind of market what the program is about if you can say it is about this and it is not about that. So that's just something I hadn't really thought about as we launched into this. And then also the last point, to give constituents ownership, help the people who are part of this build it together. And so I think that's a major undertaking. My little thing, 7 seconds left. So, that we don't know everything. The staff doesn't know everything. In fact, the people who are using it can teach us a lot of really good information. So that's something that we sort of, that community building is really central to what we're trying to accomplish there. So.
No, I got it. All right. Hello again, everyone. I'm going to be talking about some workshops that we do at the University of Virginia Library. If you go to the first slide. So what I've got up here is just a snippet of the top of our program. There's actually about 50 of these that we do in a semester, so this goes down pretty far, but I couldn't fit it on the slide. And you see we've got some general categories, and what I'm going to focus on is the general programming category, and I'm going to talk about our Introduction to Python workshop. And this is a workshop that's popular, and we've been teaching this Introduction to Python for a few years now. And what I want to focus on is where it was when we started teaching and where it is now and how we've improved it through an iterative process of teaching it, learning from what worked and what didn't work, making improvements, and then carrying on for the next one. And so to explain what I mean when I say a workshop, because it's different to everybody, we're looking for something 1 to 3 hours long and very interactive. So it's usually about 20 people that come in, and they bring their laptops with them. And so they're sitting there, and when I'm up at the front, I'm looking at an entire audience full of those little apples, that are on the laptops. So much so, actually, I was using Windows, and when I do my demos, they'd come up in a Windows screen, and then I couldn't interact with the Mac users, so I actually talked to my librarian and got them to get me a Mac laptop so I could use it, so that I could learn that operating system. And that's just one example of just digitally, people were used to interacting with one system versus the other, and it was a huge barrier that we overcame. But anyway, so that's our workshop. And so when we're dealing with Python, we're talking about a programming language. And for me, when I think of Python, I think of this. If I can get the next slide. So this is a terminal. Might be bringing you back to those old MS-DOS days where you're, got the C prompt or whatever, depending on your persuasion or your memory. But you got those 3 greater than symbols, and then that cursor would normally be flashing, but for this presentation I just took a screenshot. And I would teach it this way, and I would throw this up on the screen, and I would start going to town. And it was really confusing for all the students. They were struggling with picking up the Python concepts. And what I realized was that this is actually very intimidating, because it doesn't give you any help. You're just sitting there and it gives you no information back. It's just a cursor flashing at you. And I say I figured it out, but it actually wasn't an easy process to figure it out. There was no magic survey. It didn't happen overnight. It was through talking to people who had puzzled looks on their faces, and it was by interviewing people who had taken the workshop to figure out what was going on and what was causing them difficulty in learning the stuff. And I'll also admit sometimes I wasn't teaching it the best either, so I picked some of that up as well. But I'm going to focus on the one which was the decision I had made to teach it using the terminal, because that was the way that I was used to doing it. And so then what I went looking for was a way to teach it using what they were used to as opposed to me. And this is similar to the Windows versus Mac conversion that I made earlier. And so if you hit to the next slide, this is probably going to be too small for you to make out details, but this is what's called an integrated development environment. And the thing in the lower right-hand corner is the terminal for Python. So you still have the terminal, But this one, you'll notice, is friendlier. It's got all these words, including one of them, I think it says help up there, actually. And so it's a friendlier way to interface. And then also, there are other things that people are familiar with and used to seeing that they just don't get when you only have the terminal. So all the way up at the top, there's a little disk icon that represents the ability to save. And just having familiar things like that really put people at ease and make them feel more comfortable. And then you've got a panel on the left-hand side that's showing them where their code goes. And so it wraps everything up into one nice package of here's my code, here's how I can save it, here's this scary terminal thing, but now that it's got friends, it's not so bad. And, that was really a big step, was going to teaching it. So now, when I'm teaching the workshop, this is the platform that I teach it from, as opposed to the terminal. And we get a lot better response, and we get a lot more user involvement. They don't check out as much. So with that, I'll move on to takeaways on the last slide. So the first thing is, my advice is to match your methods to the user's strengths. So all the users were familiar with graphical user interfaces. That's what they've been using. I should say our target audience is graduate students. So for most of them, it really has been the generation of everything's been done with a graphical interface and a mouse. Not quite to the touchpad generation yet. And then that's what they're strong at, so that's what we use. The next thing, teach them to do it their way, not your way. This is sort of just another pivot on that same idea, but I had a way that I like to do it, but that wasn't the way to go, so it was teach them their way. And then the last thing is talk to the audience when things aren't going well and get their feedback, and it'll improve. Thank you.
Okay. If you want to go to the first slide, I think. Yeah. In the context of museums, I define co-creation as providing skills and resources to address express community needs. Of importance beyond just addressing those needs, in co-creation, the community is integrally involved in all phases of the process. In the best of circumstances, through logistical support and training, co-creation results in locally sustainable cultural heritage projects that align with both the community need and the museum's mission. Or as John Cotton Dana's mandate of 99 years ago goes, learn what aid the community needs and fit the museum to those needs. Now of note, I don't see that co-creation necessarily involves digital technology, but in the case studies I will report next, digital technology was a part of the answer to the questions that were being asked. So on the first one, the first case involved a project between the C.H. Nash Museum at Chucalissa in Memphis, Tennessee, and the surrounding community that is 95% African American. Time precludes providing the detail, but the project flowed from addressing the residuals of Jim Crow era segregation between the museum and the community. At the instigation of 9 high school students who were involved in the process, what started out as a project to co-create a single exhibit on materials excavated from a 1920s era farmstead that are seen in the exhibit case on the right of that one's photo, morphed into a multi-year project that collected over 30 hours of oral history interviews, resulted in multiple documentaries, created a resource center, and digitized all of the materials onto the southwestmemphis.com website. We need to tell more people about our exhibit was a statement by the president of the Neighborhood Association when the exhibit opened. And I'll note that when we approached this gentleman initially about participating in the exhibit creation, his comment was he, quote, didn't want to have anything to do with those low pants wearing kids. This project is now in its 6th year of co-creation, and the gentleman is a lead proponent of it. The next one. Fresh from this above experience, and after a couple years of mixed success with my museum practices graduate seminar students on creating products for rural communities in Peru, we had sort of an aha moment. As we met in the 400-person village of Hualcayan, Peru, instead of proposing projects, we asked the 6 assembled teachers from the village school, what can we do that would be most helpful for you next year? Leodon Alejo, the high school teacher, immediately responded, we need to know our local community history. He noted that the books provided by the government contain national and even regional histories, the textbooks, but nowhere was the local history ever recorded. We propose that we leave a couple of flip cameras and a laptop in the community, and that over the next 5 months, the high school students interview their elders and community leaders about the village history. We propose that we could then summarize the oral history into a book. In the picture here, you see 2 students in a crash course on interviewing procedures. The students had never used a video camera or even held a smartphone before. We were not certain what to expect, but when we went back in January, the students had completed 20 10-minute interviews of a very good to excellent quality. 51 weeks after this initial discussion of the idea, we delivered 100 copies of La Historia de Hualcayan, the history of Hualcayan, at the July 28th Independence Day celebrations in the village. And finally, based on our reputation of work in Hualcayan, we were asked to launch a project on the north coast of Peru in the small village of Naveen, located in the midst of vast prehistoric archaeological sites. Specifically, we were asked to provide expertise to properly curate material in their small museum school. Our response was to their expressed need that we need to preserve our cultural identity. We secured tablets, digital scales, video cameras, and other equipment, and provided the training that the students in the school now are charged with preserving their cultural heritage. We intend to return for the next 5 years to continue this process. Our takeaways on this are, first of all, that co-creation is messy and it's non-linear. Secondly, that we feel that this co-creation was extremely helpful in dividing logistical expertise that would ultimately not be reliant on us outsiders to be performing. It results in products not for the community, but by the community, and I think that's an extremely important distinction. And in doing so, it develops local stakeholders and buy-in locally based on their cultural heritage. Okay.
Hi, everyone. So my story is going to have a lot of the same sort of thematic connections as my other panelists. The idea of knowing your audience and there kind of being no handbook for the process and the project that you're handed when you get hired for a job or when you sort of set out to do something is somewhat part and parcel of a lot of the work that I've been doing over the course of my research career, but is definitely a core component of how I was hired to do this research project at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Thank you. I was hired because the NEH and the NEA were celebrating their 50th anniversary, and they wanted to identify, what have we been doing for the last 50 years? What is the great benefit we've been giving to the field by giving out money to museums, libraries, archives, after-school programs, and educational institutions over time? What they had and what they had been working on up until that point was, is what's on the right-hand side, which are punch cards that actually are records of individual grants. They had been digitizing all of this information and hand-coding old data, so they had an entire corpus of every grant ever given by the agency. And that was a lot of data, but it is administrative in nature, not unlike DAX. It's records that sort of describe what is the grant, who was it given to, what was it intended to do, what was the dollar amount, right? There's sort of like a really almost accounting sort of look to that kind of information. And when I got there, I also realized that there were some other things that could be of use to me. including other reports produced by other organizations like the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. They had done some work trying to understand what is the importance of the humanities and where's the field changing to. NEH had also done some program evaluation of their own. And so I found that some of the findings of those reports allowed me to say that, there was a long-term impact in some of the grant making, which was really interesting. But they were, tailored to those particular programs. So coupling that with, the long history of the NEH and then some of these other comparisons, I was really sort of trying to figure out what is the narrative, how do you talk about the impact of giving money. And that report was an interesting endeavor, and there was no handbook to it. The most interesting aspect of writing this report was not just trying to craft the right narrative out of the data itself, but actually negotiating what that narrative would be based on where senior management in particular, but also others who had a long-term investment, not only in the agency, but also in the field, felt like they had a stake in it, right? So how do you know your audience well enough internally and externally to provide something that hits the mark on all places? That was kind of a constant in all of the negotiations I had, not just, I have some data analysis, I'm going to sort of, give you drafts and we're going to talk about it, I can get some notes, I can kind of get some feedback and such from colleagues or from internal colleagues. That, of course, I did, but what became evident is that there wasn't a singular narrative and that there wasn't necessarily agreement. And so part of the labor of the work was not just understanding the data, but was also understanding who the audience was going to be, where it was going to be going, and trying to negotiate the space in between, right? Trying to figure out how to make it hit for everybody. The other project that I worked on while I was there was a series of new data collection questions and methods for programs internally at NEH. This was not something someone had done internally in recent years. They wanted to know not just what are the grants, what are the things we've been giving money to, but how do we know that what we gave money to was really interesting in the short term, right? How do we get from individual grantees some metrics and some counts of things that might tell us how successful they were at the particular project level? And so instead of negotiating with senior management and sometimes other leaders of other organizations and peer organizations on a drafted report, what I was doing internally was kind of anthropologically going around and trying to understand people's desires and needs that they had for what they couldn't say, what they needed data in order to say. And so I started out with a needs assessment, talking to a lot of program directors, talking to a lot of staff, trying to understand what they needed. And secondarily, I looked at, what were some of the thematic connections between different programs and also what people had said they wanted to understand. So museums get money from not just one program at NEH, they can get them from like 4 or 5. So if a museum is always eligible for getting money from NEH, then are there things that museums can always collect, like attendance at exhibitions or attendance at educational programs or what have you, right? Of course you can, right? So those are the kinds of things that 5 different programs at NEH would benefit from asking all of the grants that maybe happened at a museum, right? And they just weren't collecting that systematically. So those crosswalk comparisons were really important, and it distilled a lot of information about what we could capture. And that's where I got that identifying measures that were similar across departments. And then the other thing, of course, is reviewing, is there any accessible information that is good for comparison, or is collected systematically from third parties that tells us something about measures that maybe we should know something more about or that we could use in addition to, right? So for example, the one that I was just saying about attendance at exhibitions, museums have not collected systematically, or AAM, some other body hasn't collected systematically attendance at museums every single year, for a while. So they do it sometimes. It depends on the study and the way in which they're collecting it and for what service it's meant. But maybe NEH could just collect that from its grantees to get a better baseline of what it is, and third-party data might have complemented that sort of takeaway for them to figure out if whether or not the attendance at NEH-sponsored exhibitions was on par, right, with other museums, maybe who hadn't received a grant. What you see there on the right-hand side is a comparison of NEH dollars awarded by state in the orange. It's Alabama through Wyoming on the left-hand side. I know it's a little small to see here. The blue is private foundation giving in that same state over the same period of time. So how much money is NEH actually supporting work in the humanities versus how much is private giving supporting work in the humanities by state? That's a comparison of third-party data, that would have been interesting and comes from getting data from the Foundation Center and knowing what organizations are the same grantees, right? And then sort of organizing it by state. And this was a sort of internal process, and this was a thing that I think for me led me to understand not just more about the organization itself, but also what its needs were and what the audience would be internally for the right, what were the right things that would capture the attention of the people who actually worked at NEH as well, right? So it was this different way in which I was understanding the audience component of things and also trying to craft a method that would be replicable sort of into the future. Yeah, my big takeaways are that interest is really important. I think there were a lot of folks who were really interested in the results of both of these things, but it doesn't always lead to the greatest amount of success for a project. Data analysis in particular, data literacy is really important as underlying tools and the way in which people will come to your project and how they will also provide you feedback. But, folks might come to you who have neither of those, right? So you have to sort of think a little bit more about how that interest is important, but how do you keep people interested, and also how do you continue to make other people interested. I found that senior management plays a really key role, at least in a big organization like NEH. Getting a project up off the ground is always great because usually there is interest in doing it, but if there is no handbook for having it to get it done, you have to figure out who your big supporters are and who are your champions, and then who have to be converts instead of being champions from the get, I was only at NEH for a short time. I was only at NEH for about a year, and I think that time can really be an asset for understanding more about your audience, understanding more about the data that you're working with, doing that analysis, and really being able to have some good results that really do get you to that level of creating more champions and creating more interest. But you've seen, even still, I was able to do new things, right? So you don't always have to be completely 100% successful at achieving the first three things, but you can still get new things done. People can then see the proof of why it would be really interesting, maybe after the fact. Yeah.
Great. All right, thank you, everyone. So now we have some time for question and answer. And Carolyn, I know you were going to kind of help us facilitate a little bit. So I don't know if you've had thoughts you want to share to start us off, or...
First of all, because we didn't get a chance, I'd just like to say thank you to each of the panelists for their presentations and for being so timely as well. It was very nice to see. So thank you very much for that. That deserves an applause on its own, I think. I'm super interested in this topic, and I wasn't quite sure what the emphasis was going to be of your talks, but there's clearly a lot of crossover in terms of your experience and the success that you've had as well. So I guess a few things I was thinking about. One is sort of thinking about what your work is doing and how that might translate into a museum environment. For example, you were talking very specifically about, in some cases projects, in some cases setting up a new space. You were looking at it from a kind of funding position. And in museums, we have data everywhere. And data literacy, I think, is a massive issue because data's being collected in all different parts of the museum. Two, we don't people are collecting different kinds of data. 3, they are doing different things with that data, and sometimes they're not doing anything with it. And I think one of the big challenges for museums is how you bring that together in some way. At the worst end of it, we're collecting data about our visitors in 5 different places, and we don't have a single view of what they're doing and how they're interacting with us. And in other cases, we're, in the best possible scenario, it's a very joined-up situation. But the biggest issue, I think, is that there's a lack of ownership around that data. People feel they own it in silos, but they don't necessarily own it across the museum. And then it doesn't get disseminated, and we're not getting the insights from it that I think we want to. So I'm just wondering, from your experiences, you've all had these projects now. How is what you're doing kind of taking it forward in terms of learnings for your organizations, influencing practice in your organizations, because you've had some success, you've had some learnings. Are you seeing that being replicated anywhere else? Around the actual sort of evaluation and findings from these projects, when you do send it out to different parts of the organization, do they really understand what they're looking at? And are they able to ask you the right sorts of questions that help you to gain insight from the data? There's 55 questions in there, I'm sorry. But I'm sort of trying to relate it back to what I know is really happening on the ground in museums particularly, but I think any institution really.
Yeah.
So
Can I jump in on this
please
one?
do.
Let me get this. So this rings very true to me as a data scientist in a library, because we collect a whole lot of information, just like what you were saying. And actually, I was recently referred to in my position at my library as a data butterfly. Because I would pick up different pieces of data from all throughout the library and then talk to all the other people in the library. And just basically, I would produce a plot that I thought was really cool and had some really interesting information about our users in one segment of the library. And I would run around and show it to everybody, being like, look at how cool this is. And then eventually, I got a meeting with our dean. And so I got to show him, which was pretty cool. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I think there's a lot of connections that are made on the person-to-person level in the institution. And that's the way that you can pass the word and get it around. When you don't need to go through the whole hierarchical up the chain, back down the train structure. It's the people in the library who are engaged or interested, or the people in the museum who know each other will think it's cool. And now if it's your friend telling you the story, they're going to take the time to explain it to you and make sure that you understand it.
Sure.
That would be
your experience, yeah. Anybody else on the panel?
Yeah, so speaking specifically about NEH, I would say that part of my success in doing both products in general had to do with the fact that I was sort of the data butterfly, because yes, there was, there was also, Google Analytics on the website, and there was social media data and other sources, maybe more accounting and other types of measures that were sort of just laying fallow in a way, right? So I not only had to unearth a lot of them and figure out what they meant and how did they work, but I also thought that my personal connections with individual staff and colleagues meant that I would be able to squeeze as much juice as possible from not only that conversation, but I can go back to them over and over again. It's time consuming. That level of negotiation with, and I mean that not like as in like you're making a contract, but I mean to say like you're actually trying to build that relationship, right, in a way so that you have some commonality or some common understanding of what would be the importance of getting the data, or, you didn't tell me that you had that thing before. Now you're telling me you have something slightly different. That's really interesting to me. If I, and I just kind of keep learning as I keep talking to other colleagues. I felt like that was part of why I got as much information, and I made really good connections with a lot of the staff at NEH. I do think to your other question about whether or not people are doing the right things with the things that you're giving them, That's a really hard one to sort of answer. And the reason why I think that's really hard to answer, especially, is because, at least in Eric's case as well as mine, we're kind of the new kid on the block. So your perspective on like what's the right thing for people to be doing with that level of analysis, I think is an important wrinkle in the whole of the conversation, but you have to keep present in mind that these folks are deeply invested in what that organization, what your museum, what your library, or your funding agency looks like to the outside world, or what are the things that you're producing. I mean, Loa kind of said this in your panel just the other day on Wednesday too, which is that the Met has a certain level of standard, you know, that they want to produce their work at, right? And I don't think that that's necessarily, no one's alone in that case. So are people doing the right thing with the information that you're giving them? Maybe not in your perspective, but, you know, being open to the idea that there's a lot of interpretations to what the data is, or how it is that it could be perceived by outside people, or, you know, all the different voices in that kitchen. Or I think that's important. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, sure.
Right, just a couple, just very quick thoughts. Actually, building just on that last point about being the new kid, that was actually what had crossed my mind as you were posing the question. Is that in my experience in both libraries and museums, and I'm about to like say something that's probably way too generalist, but data, of course, is very helpful for analyzing what you're currently doing and understanding what you're currently doing. It's much harder to use a data-driven thing to try a new initiative. Right. You can identify some gaps. I think that is often the case, but it's hard to sort of say, like, we know, you know, almost projecting ahead of time what's likely to happen because of the data we have, because typically in new programs, we just don't have data to support. We may have gut instinct, and that is, I mean, I would never be somebody to downplay the quality, the importance of sort of staff gut instinct, that something needs to be, tried, something new needs to be, put forth. But then, use the data to help analyze whether it's successful and, what directions. And then the other point just about data use too that I think it's helpful in is, especially in making sort of obviously a case for sort of resource allocation and things that seem to be somewhat successful could become more successful, and especially again, that helps with the new things too.
Right.
I mean, so I think that I've seen a lot of that kind of use come up, but it's been down that track for a long time.
I'd like to say a few things that there may not be a lot of coherence to this, because this is something I've really been grappling with as well. I reflect on an article by Douglas Warts. He put together something called a critical assessment framework. And his punchline in this article was, isn't it interesting that we try and evaluate these cultural norms and things like that, and these cultural traits in museums by things like attendance, the amount of money sold in the gift shops, and things along those lines. There's a disconnect there. Beth and I were having this discussion yesterday, that you've got data people over here, you've got outreach people over here, and they don't seem to play real well together all the time. And in what it's been kind of interesting. In the funding I've gotten for the projects that I talked about primarily have been through engaged scholarship type funding opportunities, which is, you publish some articles, you engage the community, and that's what is being looked for. And since I'm one of the few people in the situation who are doing it, I get money. And I'm able to do it. And we can do, it's kind of like at the University of Memphis. This museum was the albatross around their neck for decades, because it was a segregated institution, and all had a terrible. The fellow who really became very engaged in this process after time. I remember the first meeting I ever went with him, he said, "Don't tell me what the University of Memphis is going to do for my community. The last time you were here for 2 years, and all we got was a map on the wall," which was true. And so we were able to turn that sort of that sort of thing around. And I don't know how that's going to be terribly data driven. It gets good press headlines and all that kind of good stuff. But so I'm wondering about that myself.
Any questions from the audience for the panel? Yes, lady at the back.
I'm not sure if this is going to exactly fit. This kind of comes off of what Beth talked about. I live in two worlds. I live in K-12 talked about using data and how museums can affect change and how they can use. I feel like a lot of what I do a lot of with primary sources and taking primary sources and teaching with those, that's really teaching digital literacy and data literacy all along. And so it's very, very different what you guys are all talking about teaching to museum professionals and how to use that information. So, but I just started my head thinking about, I do a lot of what I do teaching teachers, that did about how to use the information we have, the data, the census data, all the data and the primary sources. So thank you for getting my head thinking about that.
Anybody else with any questions for the panel? Yes.
So, Eric, you had mentioned that part of your takeaways is giving your constituents ownership over it because you guys are writing you shouldn't. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that, or also the panel has a similar experience with the project that you guys are doing?
Sure. I guess a couple things crossed my mind. Luckily, I suppose you could say that part of the ethos in a couple ways of specifically Virginia Commonwealth University is a very arts-heavy school. It's the #1 public ranked school of the arts in the country. And so a lot of the students who come in are artistically minded, even if they're not in the arts program. And so the idea of having a space that is about creativity is something that was automatically appealing to many people, which certainly helped out. So they were very willing to jump in and help guide it in a lot of ways, I think, in a way that was really kind of neat. And, and I don't know if that's a sort of cultural thing I come out of a history background personally. And the kind of the maker movement side of things, the maker people also have this sort of ethos of like, we're all in it together, let's all learn together. So practically what that has meant for us is a couple different things. We actively encourage people who are in our spaces to help each other. We will actually stand up, if we're helping somebody try to answer specific questions about how to do some process or procedure, we'll sort of prompt other people who may be around to see if they have, an idea and a way to chip into that kind of thing. I mean, it's something that we want people to feel like they're allowed to speak. I hate the idea of feeling like we're supposed to be the experts, you're supposed to be down there learning from us. And so the other thing, a very easy thing to do is to admit when we don't know something and say, I don't know that answer, let's together figure it out. Like the both of us will sit down and I'll work through the way I would go about answering this question, but I don't know the answer off the top of my head. But by the time we're done, maybe we'll have an answer. And again, maybe we'll have brought in a couple other people. So that's, a couple things that we've done about that. I think it just becomes the sort of instilled culture a little bit. It's not always perfect by any means. There are a lot of times people want a very fast answer. And so, it's a very library kind of thing to do. It's like, we're here to help you out. But in a larger sense, we're trying to kind of change that a little bit. And it seems to be working. So, and I can answer more questions too. So.
Great. Anybody else with any questions, thoughts, musings? All right. Beth, anything else? Or? Great. Well, once again, thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear about your projects and also to have kind of university input here. It's great. It's great to have that mix. So again, thank you very much.